All right, so I wanted to talk to somebody who has given a lot more thought to these types of questions than I have. And so my guest here is Dr. Mark Muesse, and he is Professor Emeritus at Rhodes College, Professor of Religious Studies and Philosophy. I got that right, didn't I, Mark?
You did.
Okay, all right. So you have an interesting story, both in terms of your academic work, your professional focus, but also in terms of your biography, because as I understand it, you were in Waco when this siege occurred. And I've talked about this on my show already. If people don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at my last episode. And I talked about the standoff with the Branch Davidians and the government and David Koresh and all of that. So yeah, how old were you? What were you doing in Waco, and how did all that develop for you?
Well, I actually grew up in Waco, so I spent all of my early life there. Went to college at Baylor University and graduated before I went on to graduate work in New England. And my interest in the Branch Davidians was kind of late coming. It wasn't until I had actually gotten my first position teaching at Rhodes College in Memphis before I actually became aware of the Branch Davidians and got interested in that. And it was kind of thrust upon me in a lot of ways. After the siege at Waco in 1993, a lot of media centers discovered that I was both from Waco and had a PhD in the study of religious phenomena and philosophy. And so I was contacted from all over around the world, as a matter of fact, to address this particular situation because there simply were not a lot of people trained in religion who had any expertise in talking about the Branch Davidians. So I was kind of recruited to educate myself and to speak about that in a very large platform. So that's how I got involved with it. Now, my interest in cults, as I said, was kind of slow in coming. My real interest was in the study of religion. I grew up in Waco as a very religious person and had a fascinating interest in it. But I never considered it as a career. I don't know of anyone, as a matter of fact, who, as a child, thinks that they want to become a religious studies professor. In fact, it wasn't until I went to college that I even learned that there were such things as religious studies professors.
Can I stop you just 1 second and
Sure.
ask? You said you grew up religious. Can you be more specific?
Yeah. So I grew up both in the Lutheran church early on. My parents went out to an old country church near where they grew up, and this was in the early 60s, and went to church there. And then once we moved back to Waco, we got involved in the Southern Baptist churches. And so I found myself moving more towards what we would today call the fundamentalist forms of the Southern Baptist. Now, we didn't use that term at the time. We just thought we were Christians, preferred the term Christian even to Southern Baptist.
Sure.
So once I got into, well, really high school, I got involved in the evangelical side of that tradition, went to Young Life, and then decided to go to Baylor, and got more involved and more conservative in my theology. But I never intended to become a teacher of religious studies. That was just not on my radar. I was instead planning to become a physician. I was pre-med, had gotten all the way through my pre-med requirements, majored in chemistry, and then sort of in the middle of all of that, after having taken a number of courses in philosophy and religion, began to lose my faith. I'm sure that was not what the administrators at Baylor had intended, but
You lost your faith at Baylor. It's not even like you went to Berkeley or something.
Well, there's an interesting study on this.
And let me just say, I'm sorry for people. Sorry to interrupt. For people who don't know, the joke here is that Baylor is the world's largest Baptist, Southern Baptist school. And I know, of course, it's not like a religious school, but they still make people take like Bible classes and stuff.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
anyway, the joke is like him going to Baylor and losing his faith there. But it happens all the time, you know.
It absolutely does. In fact, there are lots of studies about this, that fundamentalist students who go to a religious school are more prone to lose their faith than they are if they go to, let's say, Berkeley or
That
Harvard
is
or one of these
interesting.
other schools, simply because that sense of being persecuted or ostracized reinforces their faith. It's an
Mm.
interesting dynamic. So a lot of my friends who went to Baylor, planning on becoming Baptist ministers, ultimately gave that up and went on to something else. Some of them went on to become Episcopalians. Some of them went on to become atheists. But it has this very funny dynamic involved there. So I was one of them. I was going there not because really I wanted to be a pastor or anything, but because it did address some of my faith issues at the time. But learning to study the Bible in a critical way and learning to read some of the history of challenges to traditional religion ultimately kind of blew my mind out of the water. It was a difficult thing for me to deal with, and so by my junior year in college, I decided that I had to give up this quest to become a doctor and instead to pursue some of the philosophical and theological interests that I had. So by the time I became a senior, I sort of changed my major, started doing studies in religion, even did an honors thesis on Paul Tillich, who is probably one of the most prominent American liberal theologians. And that really got me very interested in this study because I thought here I could maintain my faith and yet not give up my intellect. That was very
Mm.
important to me. I did not want to sort of be seen as just what we'd call a fightist, someone who just believes in something because they want to believe it, but instead because there are good reasons for doing that. And that's what ultimately led me to graduate school. And then I went on to study there. I did a lot of theology. But
So sorry, just another question. You said you kind of lost I guess, your fundamentalist
Mhm.
faith at Baylor, and then, but you also said that you wanted to maintain your faith in sort of looking at religious studies and focusing on that field. So did you continue to be like a theist? Like, what was the persistent faith even after
Mhm.
you lost your old
Yeah,
beliefs?
that's a very good question. The first thing that went was the belief in the inerrancy of the Bible, because
Right.
that kind of introduces you to the historical criticism of scriptural documents. What I didn't realize at the time is that once you begin down that road, suddenly everything can come into question, and eventually it did. But I would say probably when I first started graduate school, I thought I could maintain my theism. I thought I could keep at least the parts of the faith that I felt nourished me. And so I continued along that path. But then in graduate school, I was not only exposed to this intellectual side of the Christian tradition, but also to other religions altogether. So I did a lot of work in Buddhism and Hinduism. And once I got my degree, I ultimately sort of moved in that direction and was teaching world religions probably as much as I was the Western traditions that had first attracted me. So that's how I got into the study of religion. So when I was offered a job at Rhodes College, they wanted someone who could teach religion in a liberal arts fashion. That is, in kind of what we would call a more objective way of looking at things, so that you're not doing it out of a stance of faith, but as you would teaching history or English literature or what have
Right. And people, and I think most people understand this, but just in
you. Mm,
case there's some confusion, when we say teaching something from a liberal perspective, we're not speaking politically. We're talking about the tradition of the liberal arts. So
exactly.
from a more like, well, at least supposedly analytical perspective or whatever, right?
Exactly. Exactly. I often think of liberal arts as referring not to a political position, but as referring to the idea of liberty. That is, that our
Yes.
minds are now free to think of things in ways that perhaps we hadn't already. And, you know, once you begin studying religion that way, you begin to think, wow, you know, my whole life I had this very narrow focus about what I think religion is. And it's, certainly I grew up believing that Christianity was the only way, and not just Christianity, but the particular form of Christianity that I was practicing, namely
Right.
Southern Baptist.
Born
And
again. Have you been born again? Yeah.
even among the Southern Baptists, there are groups that think that other Southern Baptists are going to hell because they don't believe in quite the same way that they do. So
Right.
that position of fragmentation and sectarianism is something that I think is kind of endemic to Protestantism. But you don't see that growing up. It's not until you get the wider perspective of what the practice of religion is really like that you can begin to see how your own life has been shaped in that way.
Okay. So, uh, I would love to ask you a bunch of questions about Buddhism or whatever, but the thing that I wanted to talk about today is the cult question, and also looking more at Waco. So tell me then how yeah, how did things kind of develop for you with the siege and everything? And
Okay, so let me begin just with the idea of cults. So in graduate school, we never talked about cults. Cults was not a
really, that was
category
not on the radar then.
that we use, right? It's not that we didn't study these kinds of traditions. It's just that we tended not to use the term cult. And the reason for that, I think, was very clear. Is that is in graduate school, we always aspired to kind of a neutral, more objective way of looking at these religious phenomena. And the use of the term cult had already by then become stigmatized. So that when you're talking about cults, you knew you were talking about a suspicious religious group.
Hmm.
And there's a whole tradition within the study of religion that goes back at least a century that endeavors to see religious phenomenon with what the term used was epake, which means to suspend your disbelief. You're going to look at this as a phenomenon in history without making initial judgments about its veracity. And that's how I began to study religion. It's, in fact, how I began to study my own faith and look back on fundamentalism, and ultimately wrote a dissertation in which I saw fundamentalism not as a particular phenomenon within Christianity, but more as a phenomenon within the study of religion itself, so that we were apprehending and not talking about fundamentalism as a negative phenomenon. Because I went to
Mm,
a liberal graduate school, and one the central enemy of
sure.
liberal graduate schools was fundamentalism. I mean, this was the time Jerry Falwell was on
Right.
the rise, and the only thing I could think that my professors ever agreed upon was that they all hated fundamentalism.
Sure.
So I kind of took it upon myself to write about that, not in a disparaging way, but in a way that could show what the dynamics of this tradition was, what its weaknesses were, but also some of the benefits that it
Well,
had.
that's exactly right, because I think that we come from similar tradition and similar, and also similar, area in
Mhm.
South Texas. And I think that I totally understand all the derision and the distaste and the outrage and the anger because of the ways that certain fundamentalists have conducted themselves, and all of that. We all get it. But like for people who've not actually experienced what it's like when that there is to be in that kind of a community, and to be among people who are really, despite all their flaws and stuff, often are really trying to establish a connection, a spiritual connection with God and with each other and with deeper meaning. Like that is something, just want to say, we don't get access to in everyday life. And I am getting really tired of people expressing this bewilderment why anyone would join a quote unquote cult, or why they would even join like a human potential or human improvement movement like NXIVM or whatever. Like, because like what, the real world is so great, real life is so fulfilling, like we're all just having this great meaningful time, and why would anyone want to go and follow someone who maybe can inspire them to go a little deeper? I
Yeah.
mean, it's not hard to understand, right?
No, no. And I could just look back on my own life. I know I didn't have any sinister motivations in getting involved in fundamentalism. It was just what was offered to me. And it made a lot of sense. And it was only later when I was able to look at different perspectives that I could see, yeah, this might have a few problems with it. But like you, I do resent those who just kind of wholesale discount religion because they think it's a bunch of charlatans and people who are out trying to make money and control people's lives. It's not that at all. I mean, there's some genuine, good-hearted people who believe some unusual things, you know. And,
Sure, sure.
so
So the cult, so the cult word. Do you think that that's, first of all, do you think that's a useful term? I know you said it was even getting out of fashion in academia and
yeah.
and among scholars. And so, do you think that that term just carries too much baggage for it to be useful? And then also, I would ask, like, it seems unclear to me what groups would qualify as a cult. I know there's the argument that every religion actually started as a cult. Is that true? Like, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I didn't think a lot about cults until one day and this was in graduate school, I was reading the New Yorker magazine, and there was a cartoon. And this is about the only thing about New Yorker that I really liked, were the cartoons. And in this cartoon, there was a man very nicely dressed with his hat on, and he was standing next to his wife, and they were talking to another guy who was very clearly kind of out of his mind. But he was holding a sign, saying, "This is the only way." And the man, who was all dressed up in his suit, very prim and proper, looked at his wife and said, "You run along, Ethel. I'm going to join this man's cult." And I thought to myself, what made that so funny is that it made me realize nobody joins a cult. Nobody joins a cult. They join what they think is the truth or a religion, but it made me aware of the fact that the cult is a term of derision, and that's one of the things that made me very suspicious of it. So what I began to reflect upon was this idea, well, where does this idea that these religious traditions are somehow problematic, where does that come from? Who's making that judgment? It's obviously not the people in the cult themselves. Nobody thinks of themselves as being part of a cult. So it's coming from outside. And that made me realize that is precisely something that has been done by religions almost from the very beginning. I mean, we've got evidence of that goes back at least 2,500 years, that different religions will cast aspersions upon other religions and try to make them seem strange or bizarre. And what has happened in more recent times is that this word cult has become used to talk about those suspicious religions. Now, the word cult, as we use it, well, at least as it was used initially academically, only goes back to about the 17th century. And it derives from a word that also gives rise to the words culture and cultivation. And it basically means development or growth. And when it was first initially used in a religious context, it was simply referring to devotion or adoration or worship of a particular deity, so that we could talk about the cult of the Virgin Mary or the cult of Dionysus. Those were common terms that were used. And it was a fairly neutral term. It was just referring to that apparatus of belief and ritual and ceremony having to do with devotion to this particular deity. Fairly innocuous term. But somewhere in the middle part of the 20th century, maybe a little bit earlier, it got to be used to talk about the kinds of religions that people didn't like
Mm.
or practiced things or beliefs that were not acceptable by the mainstream of culture. And then it got to sort of snowball and be used more frequently in that way. And I think probably the event that galvanized the use of cult in that negative way was the event of Jonestown in 1978. And everybody called that a cult because it just seems so bizarre. I mean,
Yeah.
900 people killing themselves made no sense whatsoever. And so the term cult kind of got ingrained in the popular imagination, and we've been using it ever since to talk about these kinds of uh, religions in particular, but sometimes it's being used to talk about more secular phenomena. But
Right.
but that's basically the term that we use to talk about religions we don't like, uh,
Right.
religions that seem more bizarre to us. Now, the problem I have with that is that it's very imprecise.
Right.
It doesn't come from within the group itself. As I said, no tradition calls itself a cult, but it comes from outside. And oftentimes, these outsiders are suspicious and they don't have a particularly good understanding of what these traditions are like. Nevertheless, over time, people have gotten to reached a place where they think that there is sort of this objective phenomenon called cults. And I remember when I was giving an interview here in Memphis, this is probably about 30 years ago, and I was trying to explain this to a TV reporter about how, the term cult is very fluid, it's very difficult, problematic in certain ways. And after I sort of went into my professorial lecture about that, he looked at me and says, "So, how many cults are there?" As if he had totally
Not heard what you said.
misunderstood exactly what I was trying to say. There's not a particular number of
Oh my
cults.
God.
Growing up, we always thought the Mormons were cults, and some people think that the Roman Catholic Church is cult. In fact, one of the things I discovered when I went to the Branch Davidian compound, and we'll get to this a little bit later on, um, was that I discovered some material out there. I've got a little bit of it
Yeah,
right.
so I mean, you can tell us, right? You can tell us, kind of set this up right now. Is that like after the siege and after the fire and all of that, you kind of like snuck in and like took some stuff from the rubble?
I don't like to think of it as sneaking in. I was doing serious academic work.
I just hope the FBI is not going to knock on your door after this this
Um,
interview. No, but you did. You were there to check it out.
yeah, I'll talk about that. So my parents had actually moved from Waco out to close to where the compound was.
Your parents were Branch Davidians. Come on
No, they
now.
were not Presbyterians. They were good Methodist and Baptist. But they really didn't know about this group. I mean,
Yeah.
it kind of kept to itself. Not a lot of folks in Waco even knew about it until the ATF raided the place. But my parents just happened to be living about 5 miles down the road. So shortly after the big event in 1993, I was just finishing my finals for my students, and I drove out there just as quickly as I could. Well, it just so happened that the FBI was just completing their work out there. So they went through everything, they sifted things for evidence and tried to put things in some semblance of order. It still belonged to the Branch Davidians. It's their property. It always has.
Sure.
They bought it, and so the FBI couldn't do anything with it. But the Branch Davidians had left, and the day before I arrived, the FBI had left. So I asked my father if he would drive out there with me, because he knew that area a little bit better than I did, and he and I went out there, and there was no one there. and he and I just scoured the place. We spent hours going through what was left, and it was a terrible sight to behold. Uh,
Mm.
See all these children's toys and uh, tricycles, clothing. I mean, everything just
Mm-hmm.
burned to a crisp.
Mm.
About the only thing left standing was a single building that was used for storage and as a kind of workshop. And so I went through there and I just happened to find a lot of the material that the Davidians left, and apparently the FBI had very little interest in, but I had a lot of interest in it. And one of the things that I picked up was this little pamphlet,
Mm.
and it is a pamphlet criticizing the Roman Catholic Church as a cult.
Ha!
So the Branch Davidians
Wait, what
thought
is that picture?
Catholic,
Wait a minute. I have to look. What's going on with the picture? Is the Pope pulling his strings, or what's?
yes, that's the Pope pulling the strings. You got it. He's
Okay.
got the reins in his hand.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Okay. You see what I'm
Okay.
saying here?
That is
And
interesting.
so I don't know if you can tell, but right here, if I open it up a
I
little
can
bit more.
see. Wait,
Okay. So
who's
this,
that?
I believe this is Ted Kennedy right here. And I believe that is Jimmy Carter. I can't quite
Jimmy
tell who the
Carter.
other guy is. Yeah, Jimmy Carter.
Is this
Right.
from the Carter days? Maybe. Oh,
Yes,
that's
from the
funny.
Carter
That's
days.
hilarious. Who's the guy
Right.
with the
That's
choker
who
on?
I'm not able to
Is that
identify.
like an S&M collar? What's going on there?
I
Oh, there's a lot going on there.
hadn't thought.
You could
Yes, there's
auction. You could probably auction this stuff off for a pretty penny
uh,
now.
I
Oh
probably
my God,
could.
that's hilarious. Well, that just
Oh,
shows you though.
oh, I know who it is. It's Ed Muskie. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember Ed Muskie. He ran for
kind of.
yeah, he ran for
Okay.
president back in the 70s. But
Wow,
right,
that
that
is
was that.
fascinating.
I know. And then here's another one. Criticizing Tony Alamo, whom I don't know if you
I
recall.
don't know who is that.
He's a famous evangelical, or
Oh,
was
okay.
back then. But at any rate, there it is. He's a beast. He's running a false church. He's a false prophet, and he's the Antichrist. And they use that word cult.
Wow, that
That's my
is
point here.
funny.
Is that
Yeah, yeah,
even
yeah.
even the Branch Davidians had their cults.
Yeah.
So when the Davidians are using the term cult, it kind of calls into
Right.
question, exactly what we mean by that.
So, I guess that what people might say is, okay, well, this word is imprecise, it has too much baggage or whatever. So I know there was another word that people like to use. Is it high control group? Is that
Yeah,
the
that's
term?
one. That's one
So
word.
let's sort of just see if we can. I guess okay. So what are some of the criteria then when people say cult, or I mean I know it's in what I think in my own head, but like in general, when people use the word cult or when they use the term high high control group, what are some of the
Yeah.
behaviors that they're talking about?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Um, and I want to emphasize, there's no objective
Right.
criteria that we use.
Right.
And
That's part of the problem, right? Yeah.
that is part of the problem. And basically, what the word cult means is how people use that term. And what they're referring to is ordinarily a small group that is isolated in some fashion from the rest of the world. And that's why they call them compounds. The Branch Davidians didn't call their little farm a compound, it was the ranch. They called it the ranch. But that's the term
Right.
that we use. So they're compounded, they are secluded, they're separated from the rest of culture. They usually focus upon a charismatic individual. And I think that's come to be a mainstay of the idea. So, for instance, a lot of people will talk about the cult of Trump, because he's kind of this charismatic individual who's at the center of a lot of people's devotion and belief. So you have that. And then the other thing that I think is important is the quality of education, so that people think that to be a part of this tradition, you have to give up your free will and you have to accept the authority of the charismatic individual, so that you have lost all sense of your own ability to make choices.
Do
So
you,
all of these
sorry.
things, I think, are part of the way we use the term cult today.
Do you think that, I might be putting you on the spot a little, so I don't know, but do you think that apart from apart from issues that we may have with how this is labeled, do you think that these criteria do identify a separate, distinct phenomenon?
Mhm.
Or is it one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I could say some aspects of this seem kind of cultish, but then not really. Or like, I'll give you an example. Like in the NXIVM case, for instance,
Mhm.
this issue of forced labor comes up, and one of the charges against the group or against the leader Ranieri is that he had someone spend hours typing up something or whatever, right? And they weren't paid or whatever. I spent so much time in grad school. I got my PhD as well. And like that is low pay. I understand that like you're there to learn, and
Yeah.
it's not like a horrible deal. I mean, I did it voluntarily, but I feel like there's a lot of labor exploitation that's going on in graduate school. And so I guess my question to you, which I know you understand, how useful, even apart from the term, how useful is the cult paradigm or the high control group paradigm for understanding, for really getting at the truth of what's going on in some of these groups? Is it sort of, not really? What do you think?
That's a good question. What I think the problem with using the term cult is that it tends to isolate those qualities to a particular group, and that enables people to fail to see how those qualities might also exist in other parts of society,
Mm.
like in academia or in politics or in education or in other kinds
Or the
of.
entertainment industry or what? Yeah. Right.
Exactly, exactly. So just as I was saying, the cult of Trump, well, that's not a religious kind of phenomenon, but in some ways, people do have a kind of devotion to a charismatic individual, just as they might have a devotion to a celebrity, for instance.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so you've got that going on. Another feature of cults that's often sort of paraded about is their so I will call it unacceptable sexual behavior. I was going to use the term deviant, but I don't mean that
I
in
know what you
a
mean.
negative way. I just
Yeah.
mean
Yeah.
it deviates from what's considered to be the norm. So if we're able to say, deviant sexual behavior and brainwashing and cultish isolation is part of these groups, then we're able to sort of say, it's over there without being able to say, that's in other parts of our culture as well. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, I myself might be subject to some of those dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example. I'm trying to sort of set this up in a way. One of the things that I'm beginning to see more and more is how mainstream media shapes our behavior by creating a narrow focus on the kinds of things they report on, so that we think we're hearing the truth if we listen to mainstream media. But if you listen to someone outside of that,
Mm.
for instance, for me, I listen a lot to Australian news, news from India and China, to see what their perspective is. And then I began to see that same kind of silo mentality that characterizes a cult, because
Mm.
it's compounded off, is also applying to me. I'm just unaware of it because
Right.
I only get, or I only allow myself to get, a certain kind of perspective. And so that's the thing I'm most concerned about. It's when we're able to say, these are the folks that are problematic, without sort of turning attention and becoming self critical about the kinds of things that shape our way of looking at the world.
Right. Right. Let me ask you, um, do you think that there is such a thing, apart from the term, is there such a thing as brainwashing, or do these people I guess what I'm saying is people who get into some of these groups, whether we're talking about extreme, ultimately dangerous groups like, Jim Jones, or we're talking about groups like with NXIVM, where for 99.9% of them, the greatest danger they faced was just emptying their pocketbooks and spending too much money on these courses, right? Whatever we're talking about on the spectrum of like questionable behaviors, is there such a thing as brainwashing, or are people making these choices? Like, to what degree, I guess I'm asking, do you think, does actual individual free will or enter in, and do these people who join these groups, do they bear responsibility for giving up whatever autonomy they end up giving up?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question, and I struggle with that. It seems to me brainwashing as such kind of exists on a continuum. It's hard to see the point where education ends and brainwashing begins.
Indoctrination, education, brainwashing.
Indoctrination.
Yeah.
I mean, you know that. I mean, going through the American educational system, they teach you or indoctrinate you in a certain way of looking at reality. And from the perspective of someone else, that could be considered brainwashing. And in fact, I've heard a lot of people say,
Right.
liberal education is just indoctrination. It's just brainwashing.
People say,
Uh,
yeah.
so I guess the
Or modern advertising, that we're all
or exactly
constantly exposing ourselves, or pornography or whatever. Like,
precisely
it's all kind of changing.
anything that is reinforced over and over again without showing the other side or other sides to a particular issue might be considered brainwashing. I mean, a lot of churches have their children go through catechetical classes, confirmation classes, where they have to learn and recite things over and over and over again. How is that different
Yeah.
from what might be going on, let's say, with the Branch Davidians or NXIVM or what have you? Now, if it were coercion, if somehow your life depended upon your spouting this particular idea, or if there are certain techniques, like sleep deprivation and things like that, then I think, yeah, you are moving into an area where perhaps the word brainwashing is a legitimate term, but I simply don't think that that's a qualitative difference. It's a quantitative one. You're moving in that direction. So you're trying to take
Yeah.
away people's autonomy to make those decisions for themselves.
Right, and I understand that I can hear, people saying, well, but there's a lot of religions and a lot of churches where you may have indoctrination going on, or you may have a lot of social pressure to conform or to believe, or social consequences, but you don't have a sociopath who is constantly manipulating people and who may or may not be doing things with underage girls or whatever. To which I would say, have you looked very deeply into the history of churches?
Exactly. Or politics or
Right. And
education or any number of fields. Yeah.
I remember growing up in the Southern Baptist Church. I think that the pastor, I think that our pastor was objectively a good man, and I don't think that he was. I don't think if we peeled back the cover on his life, we would see a lot of like bad things slithering around underneath. But there was definitely, growing up, there was definitely a cult of personality around this guy, and there have been a number of people in the Baptist church and other churches who got away with shady or even criminal or abusive stuff, right, under the guise of this sort of cult-like environment they create. And like I've talked about this before, but there is a lot of pressure, social pressure and moral pressure placed on people in a lot of these churches to give a tithe. When my mom has been a born again Christian for decades, and she gives 10% of her income to the church. That is a lot of money. Yeah. So it does, the lines start to get blurred there for me. And so I think that's an interesting question. At what point does something get into like actual, like, where the leader of this group is hardcore trying to manipulate people and sleep deprivation and threats and coercion and stuff. And I know that's one of the questions that comes up, like in the NXIVM case. Yeah. Was some of that going on? To what degree, if any? And that's for another discussion, whatever, down the road. But I think it's interesting. Can I ask you, do you think having studied David Koresh, I know you're not like a Koresh expert, but having probably spent more time thinking about this than I have, did he really believe, like, I know he killed himself, like he went down with the ship. Did he really, you think, believe the stuff that he was saying? Or was he just such a great sort of sociopathic, narcissistic manipulator that he just was good at seeming like he believed what he believed? And then he saw the writing was on the wall and he's like, well, I'll just take myself out. But like, do you think he really thought that he was on a mission from God?
I really do. Yeah.
Okay.
I really think that. Now, he also referred to himself as a sinful Messiah. Sinful,
Oh, it's simple. Okay.
Sinful,
Okay, gotcha.
sinful, not a
Okay.
simple
Okay.
Messiah. He was the sinful Messiah, which meant that, and a lot of charismatic religious leaders will sort of say this kind of thing about themselves. I'm not perfect, but I'm still the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I really do think that he did, on some level, believe these sorts of things. He wasn't just a kind of Elmer Gantry type.
He wasn't like a con man in the sense of like, I don't believe this, but I'm just telling people
Right.
this. Right,
Now,
right.
I do think there are con men like that,
Mm-hmm.
like
Sure.
Jim Baker, for instance, might be someone that might fit in that
Well, and
category.
that's one of the questions that comes up with the NXIVM thing that I'm
Yeah.
hoping to delve into more is like, Keith Raniere's most ardent haters say that he was just through and through just a completely non-genuine con man, and just
Yeah.
everything was just constant manipulation. Whereas then on the other side, his supporters say, no, this was a person who had a lot of depth and a lot of deeper stuff going on, and was trying to help people and whatever, even with these other issues that he had, right? So that's an interesting
Right.
question, again,
Right.
on the spectrum, right?
It is, and it's hard to know. I mean, who knows the mind of another person?
We don't even know our own minds.
Exactly right.
Problem.
But there is something about religion, the way it's structured, that makes people prone to kind of following individuals like that. Jim Jones, I am convinced, was a very committed Christian pastor to begin with.
Really?
He really was. I believe he's very sincere, very concerned about other people, but somehow getting into
somewhere along the way,
that structure where he was being adored by so many, just awakened that kind of latent narcissism. And that's one of the reasons why I think it is so dangerous to have individuals having that much power.
It's very interesting. It's a real catch-22, because on the one hand, I think, and this isn't original, Freud, Moses, and monotheism. I think that the spirituality in us is so closely tied to the desire for an ultimate parent, mommy figure. Even those of us who may be like, I'm a theist but not a Christian, so I don't see Jesus when I pray, but still, like, there's still a desire for like an ultimate higher authority. And so I think that when people in these groups, and it doesn't even have to be religious, it can be people just self-improvement groups or whatever, but everybody's searching for the answer. Right. Everybody is searching. And so of course that's often connected to personality, because we relate to personalities. And I've been watching the new show Waco Aftermath, and one of the things that it does is it has a timeline where it goes back and it looks at the rise of David Koresh. And so you see this actor playing Koresh, and you see his interactions with some of the people before things got crazy, right? And I don't know if this is accurate or how he really was, but you can see a real charisma there. And it's like, I don't think people understand sometimes that you can have someone who is extremely spiritual in the sense that they have some kind of internal charisma, that they're able to connect with people and have like real connections and maybe get people into contact with deeper parts of themselves or whatever. At the same time, they can be like, have huge parts of their lives where they're telling lies, or they're carrying on affairs, or they're treating people like shit. And like, I'm not excusing that behavior. I'm just saying it is very complex, and it often seems like the people who are the most charismatic are also the most narcissistic. And so I don't know what to do with that, but it is interesting. And you talk about how you have these figures in history that start off, whether religious or politicians or whatever, like Huey Long or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
They start off seemingly like very concerned, yes, narcissistic, but also wanting to really make a difference or really help people or with a real calling. And then it's like some kind of like Kurtzian narcissism
Yeah.
takes over.
Curse.
But seriously, right?
Right. No, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I think religion touches something that's very deep within us, and it evokes that. But in a lot of ways, there's good theological ways of talking about this. Martin Luther said we're both justified and sinners at the same time. That just because we're justified and on the right path towards God does not mean that we give up our sinful nature. And that is, I think, one of the true features of human life. It's just like that. Yeah.
It makes it tricky, I know, because when people, and you know this from being in the church, and also if we talk about some of these groups like NXIVM or whatever, it seems like it's very difficult for people to take the inspiration that they need to take from a charismatic figure, or maybe takes, if they're giving them some good direction or helping them get in touch with spirituality. It's very hard for people to take that, but to also keep in their mind at the same time, like, this is a human being, this person lies, this person has weaknesses, this person is narcissistic. Like, holding those two things in your head
Right.
is really about as difficult as trying to figure out how God could be loving and have created a world where there's so much evil and suffering. Like, it just doesn't
Yeah.
ever, I mean, let's even think about the character of God.
Yeah.
That's probably as complicated as the character of some of these these guys, these women.
At least. No, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, if in some ways that we're looking for a parental figure in our spirituality, well, what do we think of our parents? We think they can't do nothing wrong. They're always looking after us, and it's hard to get some kind of critical distance on our own parents.
Right.
But I think that's something that we have to do. That's part of maturation, of learning to be self-critical, but also critical of those that we revere.
Right. And yeah, and I think too, like, this, like, there is in all spiritual experience, there is a mysterious, I'm not saying it's necessarily from God, but there's a mysterious, strong emotional component where people are kind of swept away. And I think it doesn't really matter if we're talking about getting swept away in a Baptist church or Jonestown or a self-improvement seminar or a concert or falling in love with somebody. Like, once people sort of get going on that ride, it's really hard to stay objective. And so what I see with some of these people who join these groups is that there is a kind of like just sort of handing off with some of these people of like, okay. And it just seems almost gullible to me. But then I think, well, maybe there's no way to half-ass that. These people are desperately searching for something. They think they found it, and they just it's like getting born again when I was a Baptist, right?
Yeah, right. I think that's what Freud meant when he used the term oceanic feeling. You get the oceanic feeling, and it just kind of absorbs you, and you just want to give your whole being to it, even if that means disconnecting your rational faculties.
Okay, one more question, because one more question, and I want to see if there's anything else you wanted to say, right? Because we've gotten so much great material, and I appreciate it. And again, like I say, I'd love to get more into these things. Again, maybe we come back. Like, I'd love to talk about Buddhism for an hour, because I don't really understand that. But kind of why is it? I know not all, but why is it in so many of these cult like groups or high control groups or some of these groups that we see in the news or whatever, why is it that polyamorous or rampant sex is such a big part of it? Is it basically just that if you take your average man and you put him in a situation where he's got all these women that adore him, he's just going to start having sex with a bunch of them? Like, I'm just like, why does that seem to happen so much? Is it just the groupie phenomenon? Is that just basically it's just transplanted to these different situations?
I've thought about this a lot because I used to teach a course on religion and sexuality. I mean,
okay.
One of the things that religion is so totally fascinated with is not just the divine, but it's sex.
Sure. Yeah.
It is sex. And
obsessed, you might say.
Obsessed, exactly right. But in many ways, it's about controlling it. It's about understanding it. I think there are a lot of ways in which sexual experience parallels religious experience.
Mm.
They're very similar.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Well, we just talked about it, like falling in love, getting swept away in a way,
there you go.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. Or even in the sex act, of orgasm is just kind of like the loss of ego.
Right, right.
And in many ways, that's what religions are about. They're about sort of putting the ego aside. So there are close connections between the two, and I honestly have not quite figured it out altogether. You know what it is, but there is something about it. And another thing about this that is closely related to religion is the use of alcohol and other substances, because it
Mm.
provides a lot of the same sort of things.
Mm, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Loss
yeah,
of
yeah.
ego, and we
Sure.
call liquor spirits, for instance, and things like that. And that's why one of the things that makes AA so effective is that it's religious.
Higher
It, it,
power,
it
community,
provides
all
you
that.
higher power, so you don't have to go to the lower power, which is alcohol. Right. So
Yeah.
it's a strange thing about. I think ultimately it has to do with the body mind issue.
Mm,
There's so
mm-hmm.
many of them, but our minds are wanting to know where we fit in the larger scheme of things, and yet our bodies are so concrete and they have these urges and desires, and we don't always know how to negotiate them in a wholesome way.
Right, right. I love that famous Saint Augustine quote: "Give me chastity, but
But
not,
not yet.
but not yet." Yeah, could apply that to
I
pretty much
love
anything.
Augustine. He is my favorite Christian saint of all time.
Where did he? I don't know much about his final, like, kind of where he ended up with everything. So where did he kind of at the end of his life, was he able to kind of get control of his sexual issues or
Oh
not?
yeah.
Oh, he was. Okay, that we
Well,
know. That we know.
I don't know if we can say that he got. Let's just say he was celibate for the rest of his life, but he struggled with it, and he was obsessed with it continually.
Yeah.
To the very end.
So you're
Uh,
saying he's basically miserable his entire life, is what you're saying.
maybe
Oh
so.
man, that's
Maybe so.
funny. Well, I appreciate you being here and talking about this. This was so interesting. I think people are going to love it. Did you want to? Is there something we haven't covered, kind of relevant to this particular conversation, that you wanted to bring up?
Well, I do have some of these other
Yeah,
things.
show me some. Show us some
Well,
some Branch Davidian swag
yeah,
here.
let me see what I've got here. I was listening to your previous tape on the Branch Davidians, and you were right. They didn't really refer to themselves as Branch Davidians, but they referred to themselves as the Branch.
Oh,
And
they still do. If apparently, like, if you go out there, that's what they've got here.
yeah,
Hold on, let me make this
exactly right. So
larger.
that's the Branch, and it's a very old idea that comes out of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in which they talk about the Messiah coming from the rod of Jesse. And so that's where they get
Oh,
that
okay,
idea.
okay.
And there's a whole interesting history about the Davidians in Waco. It goes back to the first half of the 20th century. The first Davidians came there because they had actually studied the Bible. And I don't understand how they got this, but somehow, by careful study of the Bible, they determined that Jesus would be returning to Waco, Texas. All
Wow.
places.
Oh, wow. Was
That
there a
would be
reason for
the
Waco? I
place.
guess that was the founder living in Waco of this
No,
perspective.
no, they weren't living in Waco. They moved to Waco after they determined that this is where it was going to be. And they
Wow.
found this place called Mount Carmel, which is what the compound is called now, but that's not where it originally was. It was originally in the city limits of Waco, right on the lake, on Lake Waco. And it's
Mm,
not actually a mountain, but it's more like a hill that's
mm-hmm.
kind of like a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
And today it's the water treatment plant for the entire city.
Oh no.
That's where your water, if you live in Waco, your water comes from Mount Carmel. They still call it Mount Carmel.
Oh wow.
Uh, but then the Davidians decided to leave there because the city was kind of encroaching upon their territory. But
Mm-hmm.
they had hundreds of people moving to Waco to live on this hill. living in tents and building houses. And then ultimately they decided to move out outside the city limits to that little town. It's called Elk,
Mm.
or sometimes it's close to a place called Axtell, but that's where they are now. So it just always struck me as being a very interesting thing that they had actually picked Waco because they thought
So random.
it seems random to me too, having lived there,
That's funny.
place where Jesus would first be
Well,
returned.
maybe it just hasn't happened yet. You left too soon. You should have
Maybe so.
stuck around.
Maybe I need to come back and sort of live
Oh my
with
gosh. That's funny. Is there anything else? Did you have anything else
Oh,
you
I
want to
just
show
want
us?
to show you this business card. This is one of the
Oh,
first
let me see here.
that I picked up here.
Who
Yeah,
is that? Is that David Koresh on there? Oh, I
that's
see it.
Koresh. Yeah, I don't know if you can see his name.
I see
It's
it. No, I see it on the left
right
at the
there,
top.
and it says David Koresh, guitar and vocals.
Oh no.
Now he thought of himself really as this great
Oh
rock,
yeah, yeah. No, he
and he
loved to
produced a
play.
lot of records and everything. And this was actually when he was living in California. And this guy Steve Snyder, you may have come across his name.
Mm.
He was kind of like his right hand man. He moved back out to Waco with him when they took over the compound back in the 80s. But this is his card, and on the back of it are all these Bible
Bible
verses.
verse. Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
right.
That is funny. That's well, it's quite a card. It's interesting you bring up the music thing because yeah, he loved to play guitar and sing, and he fancied himself a rock star, musician, or whatever. But also, and some people may know this, or if you've seen the Taylor Kitsch multi-part TV show about the Waco siege, and you saw this, but after the initial firefight, with the agents and then the ceasefire and the siege, and he was wounded, he decided, this at one point that they were gonna show these agents or these heathens or whatever, and so they got their equipment set up and they just started playing some of David Koresh's music and just like blasting it. And apparently this pissed off some of the agents because they were just like, "This is the last straw."
Oh man. Wow, that's funny because they must have retaliated because what they did was to get recordings of Tibetan monks chanting.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
blasted it,
Oh,
all
they
through
did
the.
all kinds of stuff, didn't
Oh, it
they?
was horrible the kinds of things they did. I will say one of the things that the FBI and the ATF did that was a massive mistake was treating this like a hostage situation run by terrorists. What they should have done was to get someone who knew about religious groups and someone who could talk the New Testament and treat this as a religious phenomenon rather than as a political hostage situation. That's where they made their big mistake. And it just kind of devolved from that.
Right, right. Well, maybe, I know that you're emeritus now. Maybe you can approach the FBI and create a job position for yourself. You can be
Right.
the cult
I
negotiator.
could be the cult negotiator. You bet. I could do that.
Just don't say cult. Just don't use the term cult.
Exactly.
Oh man. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much. I might have you back to talk more. I'll probably have you back to talk more about religion, Buddhism, and then later on as I get into the NXIVM thing, I would like to talk more about that. But just starting out here, I just wanted to talk on kind of what your areas of focus are. So I appreciate it. Everybody, you can check him out online. You wrote a book about the Hale Bop people. What was their name? Heaven's Gate?
Heaven's Gate, yeah.
Or a book or an article?
A small article that was part of several anthologies.
Okay, that's right. That's right. But anyway, people might see that when they look you up and some of your other work. But anyway, so thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.